I want to go through some of the NAR antitrust lawsuit, and I appreciate everybody for being on this morning's webinar. And let me give you the agenda first. The agenda is going to be sort of two or threefold. One, I'm going to go through the actual legislation, and I'm really going to try to make sure that it's basically factual and factually based. So again, I'm going to go over the NAR antitrust lawsuit, and I'm going to agenda-wise sort of go through the various slides, and I'm going to try to give everybody a really good indication of what the lawsuit and proposed settlement, and it is proposed, it's not finalized yet, what that settlement means for the industry and also you as an agent. Now, once I go through all of the slides or the presentation that I have, then I'll actually do sort of a question and answer. And normally what will happen is during the webinar, if you have questions and you type them out, my staff at the end of this, they'll actually bring me the questions and I'll sort of go through those lists. That's sort of the second phase. And then the third piece of this is basically a general question and answer. Now, even though the time agenda is approximately an hour, I will tell you that I have no time limitation. So for as long as people want to stay on this webinar to get any questions answered, I will stay on. So there's no time constraint whatsoever on this. It is booked for an hour, and that easily will allow me to get through the slide presentation. However, I do not in any way I'm going to actually cut this short where I can't answer any question out there that's still pending. So again, appreciate everybody showing up this morning, and we're going to go over the NAR antitrust lawsuit. And my name again is James Angelo. I'm the broker of Florum's Realty and Mortgage, and let's get started. If in any way any of the participants this morning feel that you have any anxiety that the real estate industry is going away, I need you to just get that anxiety off. Your real estate career is intact. The real estate industry is intact. By no means are you going to lose your livelihood. The real estate industry is very, very, very dynamic. Now, some of the processes may change, some of the paperwork may change, but whether you're a listing agent or a buyer's agent, you absolutely will have a very good, viable career. And I'm going to try to help navigate you from where we are today to where we're going in the future. The National Association of Realtors has reached a proposed settlement. The seller's ability to pay buyer's agents will absolutely continue. So at this moment, the Association of Realtors, as well as the plaintiff attorney firms, have basically reached a proposed settlement. And that settlement start date, if they agree on this, will be somewhere in early of July of 2024. Now, it's only April, so we're still about 2 months away. So things can change. It's less likely that they'll immediately change from the association standpoint and the plaintiff standpoint. Now, the Department of Justice federally is reviewing this. And that at this moment, the Department of Justice is reviewing this, and they're going to see if they want to tweak any of the language. But a lot of the framework that I'm going to go over with probably will remain the same, or all of it will remain the same. And again, the seller's ability to pay buyer's agents will absolutely continue. Now, the seller in our current environment has always been able to pay a buyer's agent. In our current environment, we take a listing, and upfront, the seller determines this is the listing agent's commission, and this is the buyer's agent's commission that they were willing to basically pay for the property, and that would be predetermined and upfront, and the buyer's agent's commission would be displayed in the MLS. Now, that part's going to change. The media at the moment is basically spinning news and a narrative that is to a large degree is inaccurate. There's a lot of negativity in the media. There's a lot of negative headlines. The end of the realtor monopoly, the 6% commissions going away. There's a lot of what I call rating headlines. It's a good tagline to get someone's attention, but it really doesn't accurately in any way reflect what's actually happening. So if you've seen all these headlines, please just disregard them. I don't need you to feel that, again, that this is in any way a doom and gloom situation, because it's not. These changes will not eliminate a buyer's agent from being paid. Now, in the future, there's two ways that a buyer's agent is going to be paid. Either the buyer can pay the buyer's agent, or the seller can pay the buyer's agent, or a combination. NAR continues to deny any wrongdoing, and that was part of the settlement. So even though they actually have a proposed settlement for early July, they have not acknowledged any wrongdoing. The settlement, again, still has to go through court approval, and part of that court approval is Department of Justice. And at the moment, NAR's already agreed to pay a little bit over $418 million over a 4-year period. So approximately they're paying about $100 million per year over 4 years. Now, the proposed release resolves most NAR members. So again, the proposed release resolves most of NAR members, but it's still being discussed, which means, again, there still can be some nuances, but for the most part, every agent, every brokerage will be covered under this one way or another, whether the brokerage did an individual settlement or they were basically encompassed through the national settlement as far as what NAR proposed in their guidelines. The competitive compensation remains a choice for consumers when buying or selling a home. And that basically has always existed, which means in our current environment, when you talk to a seller who owns a home, you have always been able to basically negotiate and say, this is what I would like for my listing commission. What do you want net for your house? And all those nuances, that net experience is really what determined the sales price, the length of term of the listing agreement, the amount of listing commission that would eventually be paid, and the amount of buyer's commission eventually paid, and all that basically stays the same. Now, some of the changes. The requirement for a cooperative commission is now optional. What that means is most of the MLS systems in the United States at the moment have required that for a listing to be put into the MLS, some dollar amount had to be put in. It couldn't be zero, which means if you were showing the buyer's agent's commission, whether they were a transaction buyer's agent, single agent, non-broker representation, there had to be some sort of percentage or dollar amount. Couldn't be zero. Had to at least be $1 or something, some compensation. In the future, and a lot of MLS systems have already made this change, and I think they're going to continue this change, is that no, zero or no dollar amount will be allowed in the future, which means if you take a listing in the future and you're talking to a seller, it will have possibly a 2% listing side, a 3% listing side, a 4% listing side. That listing commission that you choose to have with your seller, you basically get to negotiate. Now, on the buyer side, you're really going to have a choice, and the seller and you are jointly going to sort of talk, and the seller is eventually going to make up their mind on whether they want to predetermine, do I really want to set a commission amount up front? Now, if they say no, they can say, look, I don't want to pay any buyer's agent's commission. It will be zero. They can say, I will pay a dollar amount. I'll give $5,000. I'll give $50,000. I'll give 1%. I'll give 5%. The seller gets to choose. The big difference as far as the not requiring that it be mandatory to put in the MLS is it can now be zero. It does not have to be a dollar amount. Advertising a buyer's agent's commission in any MLS field or third-party system using MLS data is now prohibited, which means you cannot, even though when a listing is going to go into the MLS system, the buyer's agent's commission will no longer be displayed in the MLS after July 1st or shortly afterwards. The MLS systems are going to change. And even if the seller does decide to predetermine that they want to offer a certain buyer's agent's commission, you're not going to be able to view that in the multiple listing system. It's not going to display. All realtors and MLS participants must have a buyer's agent's broker agreement executed before touring can occur. This is actually probably, again, one of the most significant items. In our current environment, if a real estate agent meets a buyer and the buyer wants to see one home or variety of homes or tour a home, which also includes open house. In our current environment, the agent can meet them and they can basically show whatever properties they want. The listing agent can let them in an open house. In the future, every agent in the United States, prior to having a buyer tour a property that's listed for sale, the buyer is going to have to sign a buyer broker agreement. On that buyer broker agreement, it's going to specify either a time period and or a property or multiple properties. And some of those specifics on what the document is, looks like that revised buyer broker agreement, that is still being worked on. And when it comes out, we will have separate seminars, several webinars, basically going over the document for you. So we can help you with the minutia of this is what the document means to you, and also some of the things you can put in it. What happens if it's new construction? What happens if it's an open house? So you can figure out how you want to put various clauses. What happens if a buyer has somehow signed more than one of them? All of those scenarios basically have to be worked out. But one thing that should give you security as a buyer's agent is that every agent in the United States going forward in the proposal is that if a buyer wants to see a home, he is going to have to sign some agent's buyer agreement. And on that buyer agreement, it's going to specify what the actual agent gets compensated. The final compensation must not surpass the agreed terms and the buyer broker agreement. That means if your buyer broker agreement has 3%, shows that you're supposed to receive 3% commission, and you show a property and that seller had predetermined that they would pay 4%, you cannot receive the other 1%. The maximum amount of money that you can receive is what you have displayed on that buyer broker agreement. And no, I really doubt, by the way, that it can be open-ended, which means I don't believe you're probably going to allow a statement saying whatever percentage happens to be what the seller offers, because that defeats the whole purpose. What they're really trying to do is they're trying to upfront have the value of a buyer's agent negotiated with the buyer without the ambiguity where it changes, where it fluctuates. Again, what happens in situations if the buyer doesn't like the buyer's agent? How do you fire a buyer's agent? If they have a piece of paper basically stating that you absolutely are going to be paid? Are there any stipulations of work performance, which means after you get it signed? What if the agent doesn't do a lot of the steps necessary for the buyer? Is the buyer sort of out of luck? All of those situations are going to have to be worked one by one. And over the next 30, 60, 90 days, hopefully a lot of those scenarios will be discussed and we can get some guidelines. Because I can sit here for a half an hour and I can just give you scenario after scenario after scenario that doesn't fit a very clean four-corner box. Again, what happens if the agent is not performing? Is he still paid? What happens if the buyer wants to switch agents? What happens if on purpose or by accident, the buyer actually signed more than one buyer broker agreement? All of those scenarios we're going to have to sort of work out together, but I promise, whatever the answer is, I'll help and I'll give you clear guidance. What I want to do this morning in April of 2024 is simply sort of go down, at least factually, what I understand and what really exists today. I'll give you a glimpse of some of the open questions, but I'm probably not going to answer those scenarios at this moment. So again, the commission can absolutely be paid to the buyer's agent by the seller. A seller can absolutely predetermine, if they wish, the buyer's agent's commission, whether it's 2%, 3%, 4%. And they can pay that possibly as a true compensation, which means the seller is going to agree to pay the buyer's agent, or they could pay it as a concession, saying, I will give the buyer 3% concession, and then the buyer's agent can use that money for whatever they want, closing costs, realtor, buyer's agent expense. There's probably two main ways that the seller can move that money, whether either concession or outright simply paying the buyer's agent. The percentage, if they do choose a percentage, you will no longer be able to view it in the MLS. On a buyer broker agreement, whatever the percentage you have on there, you can receive less, but you cannot receive more. So if you're negotiating, it is possible for you to reduce the amount that's on the piece of paper that you've agreed to receive, and the buyers agreed that you would receive, but you cannot increase it. The seller's contribution to the buyer's commission can be negotiated within the purchase contract. Now, I'm going to tell you what I think is probably going to happen. I believe, and again, this is not a legal opinion. This is simply an educated guess, an educated observation. It's not a legal opinion. I'm not stating anything of law. I believe that the more time that goes by, that given that every single buyer is now going to have to sign a buyer broker agreement, what is going to happen is I really do not see an army of buyer's agents making phone calls to an army of listing agents saying, hey, I want to see this house. Can you please tell me over the phone what is the actual commission that the seller is willing to pay me? I don't believe you've got an army of agents calling another army of agents to see what the buyer's agent's commission is. What I think is going to happen is over time, the longer it goes, buyer's agents are simply going to submit these purchase contracts and say, here's my offer. And the seller is going to look at it with their listing agent, and the listing agent and the seller particularly is going to evaluate it. And the seller is going to evaluate, what does that net experience mean to me? What is the purchase price of it? How much of a binder are they putting down? What is the buyer's agent's commission that they are requesting that I pay as the owner? How many days to close? Is it a cash? Is it financing? Is it contingent on selling their home? I think what's going to happen is, as those purchase contracts are sent over one after the other on the properties that are listed for sale, I believe that they're simply going to negotiate real time individually, one contract upon another. Again, without giving legal opinion, I would also probably make the assumption that more buyers are probably not going to want to go out of pocket to pay the buyer's agent commission that they've agreed that the buyer's agent would receive. So they're probably going to try to incorporate that buyer's agent's commission on the purchase contract where the seller would pay it. And I'll give you a quick example to make you understand how simple this can be. If you have $1 million property and a contract comes in and the buyer's agent only wants 1%, but the buyer is offering $700,000 on a $1 million home, and another contract comes in and this agent wants a 3.5% buyer's agent's commission, and it's $975,000, which is only 25 grand off the actual list price instead of $300,000 off the list price. The other one has a contingency. They want to sell their house. Yours does not have a contingency that there has to be any sale of the house. The seller is going to look at the net experience. So what I'm trying to make you understand is, I do not see the seller just looking at the buyer's agent's commission and saying, whatever is the lowest number, that's what I'm choosing, because that's not really the experience that they have to take into account. It's all of those elements. It's price and terms that are going to determine as a whole how the seller reacts. So again, I really do not see an army of buyer's agents literally calling a buyer like an army of listing agents trying to figure out what the commission is. I really think that over time, buyer's agents are simply going to keep sending the offers, and they're just going to be negotiated one after the other through the negotiation in that purchase contract. It eliminates the requirement that the seller must make an offer to pay the buyer's agent, which means, again, the seller absolutely does not have to mandatory make some sort of compensation offer to a buyer's agent. It can now be zero. It also eliminates the requirement that the MLS must show compensation to the buyer's agent. This is now prohibited, which I also went over, which means you are no longer going to be able to view if the seller does decide that there is a buyer's agent's commission to be offered. You're not going to see it in the MLS. Settlement language again. The proposed requirement prohibits another third-party source, such as showing time, is just one example, or any other web technology to display buyer's agent's commission, which means any of the data feeds that the MLS is sending this information to, those data feeds cannot be an alternate source that has all of these buyer's agents commissions listed. You can't, the Department of Justice and in the settlement language, they're not going to allow it to be rigged, where somebody can circumvent the intent, which is they do not want the buyer's agent's commission to be displayed and be able to be viewed or searched beforehand. So whether it is the MLS itself, Realtor.com, Showing Time, or any other third-party source that's receiving this data, they are not going to be allowed to put that language in there or that number in there showing a buyer's agent's commission. There's no way to cheat. Now, if there are current rules or laws or regulations that seem to contradict this, they are going to have to change. This was just one of them. It's like Article 16.6. I'll give you an example. Take the example that in our current environment, it's my understanding that if you have a VA buyer, which means they want to use a VA mortgage, that buyer legally cannot pay a buyer's agent's commission or fee. Well, somehow that's going to have to be reconciled, because if you're making it mandatory that every buyer now has to sign a buyer broker agreement, where the buyer, by the way, is guaranteeing the payment. The buyer is saying, I'm going to hire you and I'm going to guarantee you that you'll be paid 2%. You'll be paid 3%. You'll be paid $5,000. You'll be paid $50,000. Whatever that guarantee is, the buyer is saying, as I submit purchase contracts, I'm going to guarantee that somehow either I'm going to pay it as the buyer, I'll put it in the offer so the seller pays it, or I'll do some combination. I'll put in the offer that I submit on a home that I'm paying some of it, maybe the seller's paying some of it. But the buyer is guaranteeing to the buyer's agent that they're going to make that payment. That sounds on the surface that is in contradiction to our current VA mortgage guidelines. So if I am correct, and it is in contradiction to the current VA mortgage guidelines, which says that a buyer absolutely by federal law cannot pay a buyer's agent, somehow somebody, before this goes fully into effect, they're going to have to reconcile these, what I see as conflicts. So I don't need you to worry about them. If there are other conflicts that you can think about, either legislation or laws or guidelines, they're going to have to work that out so they don't put this in place. And there are other rules and regulations that basically would make it illegal or a violation. Now, the big question, and again, I've already addressed some of this, is should you pre-negotiate a cooperative commission with your seller? The quick answer, and again, this is not a legal opinion, I'm not giving legal advice, but I believe that the more time that goes by, I believe that you're going to see listing agents not predetermining the actual buyer's agent's commission as we do today. And that's not a bad thing. I'll explain why, but it truly is not a bad thing. I do see the listing agents letting the seller understand that it is probable or possible that if the majority of the buyers that are going to potentially buy your home have representation by an agent, and every single one of those buyers has a buyer broker agreement, which they have signed up front, that it is very probable or possible that the purchase contracts coming in are going to request that you, as the seller, pay some sort of buyer commission. So even though I may not have the seller predetermine the exact number up front, I'm going to probably set the stage or the expectation that purchase contracts will come in asking you to do it. And while I'm setting that expectation, I'm also going to have the expectation that our current environment, just like the future environment, the seller, you're just simply going to evaluate what does the purchase contract net offer mean to you, whether it's the days on market, whether it's contingency, cash offer, the commission that I wanted as a listing agent, the commission that the buyer's agent wanted on to be paid for the buyer's agent. All of those factors will come into play as far as what they're willing to accept. But I do believe that the more this goes on, you will not see listing agents predetermine an actual percentage. They'll say it's 0. However, as purchase contracts comes in, they probably advise their seller that those purchase contracts will most likely have a commission that the buyer's asking them to pay, because a lot of buyers are not going to want to go out of pocket to pay the commission themselves. They simply want to roll it into the deal. Now, ultimately, the seller will evaluate the buyer's agent's commission on a case-by-case basis. That's truly what I believe. Again, the longer it goes on, I think that will probably be the norm, and actually having these upfront predetermined amounts will not be the norm. And without going on a tangent, this is probably one of the best things if you're a buyer's agent. I know you may not see it now, but I'll explain why. Up until this moment, if you were a buyer's agent and you were working with a buyer and you were professional and you knew your craft and you were diligent and you worked with this buyer for a week or a month or 3 months or 6 months or a year, whatever that time frame is, up until this moment, you really had 2 things. First of all, you never had a piece of paper normally that stated that the buyer had signed guaranteeing you that for all the hard work you're doing, that you're going to be the agent on the deal. And I know that because every single week I get phone calls that have to deal with procuring costs. As the broker of Florida Homes, Realty and Mortgage, I get phone calls week after week regarding procuring costs where agents in the company have shown property and some other agent is trying to say they have claim on this because the buyer, regardless of the work that this agent did, says, well, I'm just going to use somebody else. I'm not saying that you won't have situations that come up where it won't be contested, but it's going to be a whole lot less. The other aspect is that for the first time, you as a buyer's agent, and this is important, you are going to, for the first time, determine what you actually get paid for. If you had a buyer in our current environment and you were showing them property, $1 million homes, and you randomly come across a property, it's a great property for the buyer likes it, and the buyer's agent commission was $2,500. You're getting paid $2,500, $2,500, regardless of whether you think it's equitable, regardless of the amount of time you put in, regardless of the complexity of the deal. That's what you're getting paid. You in no way had the ability to influence what you make in your career. Now, listing agents have always had that ability. Now, the listing agent truly did not believe that they could agree with the seller jointly what they wanted to be compensated as a listing agent. The listing agent didn't take the listing, and the seller was okay with that. So if the seller and the owner couldn't get an agreement, they just did not enter. They didn't enter into that contractual obligation. For this first time, the buyer's agent is also going to have that ability. So you are going to be able to determine what you want to get paid per customer, which in our current environment, you could not influence. So again, I actually do believe that you as a buyer's agent, you're going to like the fact that you can determine what you get paid, as well as the amount of procuring cause situations where you have to try to fight to try to justify being put on a contract when you have worked hard to basically get that contract to the door. A lot of those situations are going to fall out and they're not going to happen anymore. Agents have a new ability to negotiate seller contribution to pay buyer's agent's commissions at the time of the offer. Again, what you're going to see is within the purchase contract, the buyer's agent with the buyer's agreement, obviously, because it's the buyer that's making the offer, the buyer can basically request that the buyer is going to pay the commission to the buyer's agent, that the seller is going to pay the commission to the buyer's agent, or somehow they'll split that amount, whatever the percentage is, they'll put that in the offer. And that compensation can come as a concession the seller is giving to the buyer, or it can just be an outright that the seller is actually just going to pay the buyer's agent's commission. Right now, in the proposed verbiage, both of those would be allowed. Co-op commission. Given all buyers will have signed a buyer's broker agreement, sellers will now entertain each offer independently, which is basically what I'm saying. You're going to see every offer come in, and the seller's basically going to look at this net experience. Now, the new buyer broker agreement. To see an open house, will you have to sign a buyer brokerage agreement with someone? The quick answer is yes. If you, as a listing agent, are doing an open house and buyers are coming up and they want to preview the house, they're going to have to sign a buyer broker agreement before they're allowed to preview. Now, what happens if they already have one within their agent? I'm not going to get into all the scenarios, but I will let you know that even in open house situations, that before the buyer sees that open house, they're going to have to sign someone's buyer's broker agreement, yours or someone else's. And if it's someone else's, I'll go through different scenarios. What happens if there's a conflict? Do you show it? Can you still show it? Does the other agent now have to come and actually accompany them? There's too many scenarios. I'm not going to work those out at the moment, but I will let you know at least that in a current environment, that even in open house situations, a listing agent as well as a buyer's agent, before they show any property, including their own listing, a buyer would have to have a buyer broker agreement with someone. This gives buyer's agents more control over negotiating their compensation than our current environment. Again, I truly see this as a positive influence, because for the first time, you can ensure that if you are working hard for a customer, you will get paid a certain compensation. I know that whenever I go to a physician's office or my CPA or an attorney, they tell me very clearly, this is what I'm going to do for you, and this is what you're going to pay me. And if I sign that agreement, that retainer, or that document up front, that's what they charge me. So you will finally be able to have the same security that you'll get paid a certain amount of money, just as a listing agent has always had that security that they would receive a certain amount of money. Now, there are three fundamental elements that are going to probably define your real estate agent, your success as a real estate agent. The first element is really the financial commission model the agent is under with their brokerage, such as commission split and fees. I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but I do want to address that if the buyer's agent is now going to have to upfront sort of define and sort of prove their value, and there's more of a negotiation where the buyer's agent is going to have to get the buyer to agree to a certain compensation, that effort, that preparation that the buyer's agent's now going to have within themselves, as far as quality of work or presentation, I cannot see in our current environment where a lot of agents are going to choose a high commission firm. The 50-50s, the 60-40, the 70-30, the 80-20s, I think are going to end up with a lot more pressure to justify the model. And I can pretty easily prove it, because you as an agent are now under more pressure to justify your model, which means what you get paid as a buyer's agent. If it gets harder for you to justify your money, it should be harder for your brokerage to justify what they want to take from it. Probably the easy way of saying it. So I see the high commission brokerages having an edge, because they're going to have to show a lot of value. There's going to be a lot more value a brokerage is going to give you for the dollars that they take from you. If you're going to be forced to justify why you should be paid, I see a similar thing happening with the brokerage firms where they're going to be forced to prove why you should give them the money that they want from you. The other aspect is the support the broker provides you, particularly as a buyer's agent and a listing agent. The support must be more than just motivation. It needs to also be financial support. And I know that sounds odd, but I'll give you an example on the listing side. And in our current environment, particularly as we go to the future environment, there's going to be a much more drastic push for all agents in the industry to prove what they are worth. I cannot imagine, given the narrative and the headlines out there, that whether you're going for a listing in the new environment or you're working for a buyer in the new environment, that they're going to question or try to push back so you can at least justify why should you get paid 2%, 1%, 4%, 5%, 5,000, 50,000. You've got to be able to justify it. From a listing agent standpoint, training is important, and motivation and sales tactics are important, but there needs to also be a financial support. And I'm going to give a very brief summary of what we have at Florida Homes. On the listing side, Florida Homes Realty and Mortgage has a luxury program, which a lot of you are familiar with. Now, I'm not going to go over the luxury program. It absolutely allows you to go put your listings in a lot of high-end marketing periodicals online, New York Times and Robb Report and a whole host, and international. But one of the important factors in this, as you're trying to build your career going forward, is the financial support, which means when you use Florida Homes Realty and Mortgage luxury program, you do not go out of pocket and pay for it. So if you have $1 million listing and it's $1,000 to market the property, and the marketing of the property, by the way, is what helps you make the appointment and also helps you actually get the listing, because you proved to the owner, the seller, that you were going to advertise it. And that if $1 million property costs approximately $1,000 to use our program, you, as the real estate agent, do not have to come up with $1,000. We cover that for you. We actually pay the upfront cost for you. So if you have 2 listings, if you have 5 listings, 10 listings, if you have 4 listings coming in, it would require, if they're all $1 million listings, you'd have to go out of pocket $4,000. You don't have to do that. Florida Homes Realty and Mortgage is going to give you the financial support, and we're going to actually come out of pocket for you, so you don't have to come up with the $4,000. You only pay at closing. And one of the other factors that's really important is if the property doesn't close for any reason whatsoever, we will cover your bill. Your bill is waived in full, and that's regardless of reason. So if the listing expires, don't worry about it. I'll pay your bill. If there's a problem with title, we'll pay the bill. Any reason whatsoever it doesn't close, we pay it. Buyer doesn't get approved for the mortgage, we'll pay the bill. Regardless of reason, if you do not close in that listing, we will cover the bill for you. And that bill is clear, which means if you have a sale in the future, you do not have to pay us back. And the other part is the support the broker provides. It really has to enhance the buyer's experience as far as the buyer brokerage agreement. And I'll show you what that means on the next slide. But that experience, when you meet a buyer, your brokerage has to help you with. You should not be on your own. You should be provided a really good digital presentation and packet, as well as a physical presentation and packet, depending on which version you like better. But both of those options need to be available. Now, Florida Homes has always been a leader in the industry, and I personally saw in 2008, which is the year I founded the company, I saw a phenomenal opportunity. In 2008, the entire real estate market crashed. It was probably one of the worst crashes in the real estate market since the Great Depression back in the 20s. 1920s, not 2020s. So in 2008, I saw a phenomenal, unique opportunity. I now see the same opportunity in 2024. I see it as a great opportunity for the agents to really build a great real estate practice, as well as the company to support the agents in doing so. So if you have in any way that you think this is a negative event, I don't need you to have that perception. It's truly not. It is going to be a great catalyst to have a lot of real estate agents build a phenomenal real estate career, but you do need the support of the right brokerage to help you do it. When this is part of the support is simply education. Now, when you look at the buyer's broker agreement, and I'm not going to go through it now, but we are going to be providing a digital format as well as a physical format, which means physical presentation material and digital presentation material that you as a buyer's agent can use when you meet prospective buyers to help you get them to sign the buyer broker agreement. Again, I don't need you to have a lot of anxiety that they're not going to sign it because they're going to sign someone's. The presentation is just to help enhance to make sure they sign yours instead of somebody else's. I really want to thank you guys for watching at least the presentation portion of this. I'm going to see if my staff can come in and if they can bring in some of the questions maybe that you've had at this moment. And I'm going to read the questions and then I'll try to give you some narrative and I'll basically then just go question answer afterwards. Will we be able to collect retainers as noted on the FAR bar listing agreement? And if so, what does the process will look like? I would have to say yes. I need you to understand that the paperwork is still being worked on. So that question, I'm not going to give an absolute answer, but I would presume to say yes, you can probably request a retainer. I think that you can probably also request that upfront fee can probably also be non-refundable. I think there's probably going to be a lot of latitude on how and what you put in that buyer broker agreement. Whether it is simply the percentage, is there differentiation again, whether it's a house listed for sale versus a by owner? Is there a difference between a listed property or a by owner and a new home construction? Can I have a $5,000 upfront retainer, which is refundable? Can I have a $5,000 upfront retainer, which is not refundable? All of those different scenarios we're going to address as this rolls out. Again, it's April. So as they come and they give us more of a final document to use, then we'll go with them. And we as the company, as the brokerage, we're going to try and hash out a lot of those scenarios for you. So you're not struggling with language that you might want to have on that document. But the quick answer is yes, I absolutely think you're probably going to be able to use a retainer. If it changes, we will let you know. But my presumption is you probably have it refundable and non-refundable, actually. I've heard some offices offering to bill clients hourly for service. Is that something FHM will be allowing? We're going to allow, first and foremost, whatever the Department of Justice basically dictates are allowable ways of compensation for a listing agent and a buyer's agent. That's probably the easiest way I can say. Now, the per hour, and I've heard arguments back and forth. One of the arguments against a per hour compensation, and again, this is not legal opinion, this is not legal advice, but one of the arguments is there's a disincentive for a real estate agent to diligently get a sale to happen. If you're paid per hour, you actually make more money if it takes 20 hours to accomplish versus 5 hours to accomplish. Now, can you charge somebody for 3 hours of your time for today showing property? All of those clauses, and it's a great question, all those clauses we're going to help work through, and we're going to help give the agents of the company predetermined verbiage or predetermined ways that you can actually document that. But yes, we're going to support whatever the Department of Justice basically proposes are legal methods of compensation for a buyer's agent as well as a listing agent. And at the moment, per hour is absolutely, I believe, allowed. So we would allow that as well. Whether you're defining it up front for today's service, whether you're saying you'll keep record like an attorney does, saying, all right, these are my billing hours, I work this many. There's pros and cons, but overall, it would be allowed as long as it is allowed by the Department of Justice. Can we do a buyer brokerage agreement with a range of compensation? That one, I talked a little bit, again, the Department of Justice and the powers of be are going to really have to give us some clarification on that. I could see, and again, this is only the second webinar, I'm only in April, and already these scenarios are coming out. I could see agents trying to define what if it's new construction. Now, if it's a range, they're not going to allow a range. I do not believe, based on the current verbiage, that a range is allowed. You cannot do, I will be paid for new construction 3% up to 6%. I think that is probably in contradiction to the intent of what the language is basically trying to do. We'll verify all of these scenarios more as we go forward, but I don't believe a range is going to be allowed. I think it's possible to maybe define the various types of scenarios or properties or owners you may come across. That might be possible. The difference between a new construction home and a home that's a resale, that's possible, but I can't see a range. And one reason I can't see a range is because they specifically said that you can be paid less money, not more money. You wouldn't have to say that if they would allow a range. So I would probably say a range is probably not going to be allowed. What if at closing on a purchase, the seller, well, let me read it again. What if at closing on a purchase that the seller isn't paying any buyer's agent compensation, the buyer doesn't have the money to pay their agent, do we need to run pre-approvals on a buyer's ability to actually pay their agent? It's a great question. The buyer's broker agreement is a document which my current perception, again, without legal opinion, which I keep stating, really obligates the buyer, saying that I will make sure that you'll be paid as a buyer's agent a certain amount of compensation. So if a purchase offer is made on a property and there's no possible way that you as the buyer's agent can be paid based on what the buyer's ability is and the seller's ability is, the only other scenario I can see without giving a legal opinion is you need to go find a different property where you can be paid. And because that is now one of the elements that the buyer is trying to negotiate. The same way that you'd have to go find another element if the seller didn't agree to days to close, didn't agree to the binder amount that the buyers can put down, doesn't agree to the compensation that the buyer wants you to be paid. It's an element. So if those elements as a whole can't be agreed upon, I think you as a buyer's agent and the buyer are going to go find a different home where they are agreed upon. I hope that helps. So it is possible that that property is just not the right property given the total experience of what the buyer is trying to accomplish. Everything is compensation, not commission. But if a VA buyer has in a purchase and sale agreement on page 6 that the seller agrees to pay X% of closing costs, prepaids, and concessions, and the concessions from the seller can be paid as compensation, it has to say X of agreed on price in the purchase and sale. Gary, it's a good question. Again, I'm not going to get into the semantics of how to, at this moment, write the scenarios of purchase contract, but I will tell you, as it comes to how you fill out the purchase contract and how you end up documenting either concessions, closing cost assistance, seller paying buyer's commission, VA requirements, other mortgage requirements, other mortgage limitations. We will help you through those scenarios as we go forward. This is just one of the webinars. It's one of the initial webinars. So I'm trying to give you what the world's going to look like. I will tell you that you absolutely will have great clarity on all of these scenarios. Whether, again, it's a mortgage limitation, whether it's a VA limitation, what happens if the deal literally just can't happen because seller's not agreed to it and buyer doesn't have the money, which I really do think in that situation, you just need to go find a different house. But we will help you with a lot of predetermined verbiage. So we don't have 2,700 people basically trying to pretend that they're attorneys drafting all this language ad hoc, real time. We will help you with that. Will the buyer have to have a copy of their buyer's broker agreement with them if accompanied by the realtor that comes to open house? That question, again, that's a great question, Dawn. I need to table it. It's one of the scenarios that I was talking about. I think that if all buyers have to have a buyer's brokerage agreement signed, and it's a good question. I'm not sure if they're gonna actually have to carry them around to prove it. Don't know. I do think most of the scenarios is if they have a buyer brokerage agreement signed with a buyer's agent, they're probably going to see most, if not all, of those properties with the buyer's agent. So what happens with open houses? That's a whole caveat, which we have to see how that experience basically turns out. When you have an open house, and now the buyer's agent's now showing up with the other agent. What happens if the buyer's agent shows up and says, well, here's my agreement with somebody else, but they want you to show it? In those situations, I really need to go. I need a little more time. I need some more weeks and months to go by so we can get some clarity on the language. But we will make sure it's addressed. Is there any possible way this will be emailed to us so we can view it again? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the webinar that we're doing today will be on our back agent system, so you can view it. We're not going to email it, but you can log into back agent. We'll actually have it in the library. We'll tell you where it is. What I'll do, just to make sure everybody can find it, because we can see everybody that has been on this webinar, we will send an email to everybody in the webinar and say, by the way, this is how you find it. Please go to back agent, go to this directory, and that's what it's called. So yes, we'll be happy to do that. Second page. Can we get a copy of the slides to review? Yeah, we can do that. We'll put that on back agent as well. Do you believe that the buyer's agent will be able to reduce the initial fee that they've signed on the buyer's broker agreement? For example, we signed a 3%, but if the seller does not want to pay anything, we will take 2%. Yes, the quick answer is what you put down on a buyer broker agreement is the maximum amount of money you can be paid. You can always be paid less, you just can't be paid more. That was actually in the current narrative that they have. Unless the Department of Justice changes it, that's currently how it would work. Okay. It's basically saying there seems to be a potential that buyers agents are going to be reluctant to sign a buyer's agreement because the buyer is now agreeing to a fixed either commission or a fixed dollar amount. And what happens if the seller doesn't negotiate it? I'm sure as this initially rolls out, buyers are going to be in general reluctant to sign a buyer's broker agreement. It's new. Nobody likes change. One element that is going to basically facilitate that transformation into a norm is that they've made it a proposed federal law that across the entire United States, not just Florida, but everywhere, they're signing some buyer broker agreement. Now, whether it has what the agreement says as far as monetary amount, that can change. But I'm sure initially the buyers are going to have some hesitation to sign a buyer broker agreement because they're just not used to it. But the more time that goes by, since they have to sign someone, no matter what, before they're selling our house, eventually they're going to sign some agent that they have a comfort with. And then the comfort level as a whole, buyers are going to get 3 months from now and 6 months from now and 9 months from now and a year from now and 2 years from now and five. It just the more time that goes by, the more it will be norm, the same way that our current environment seems normal to us. My recommendation is not to incorporate the NAR buyer broker agreement because it's scary to the buyers. It needs to be simple, similar to Tallahassee. I think, and I'm not, I don't want to step out of line, but for the agents that we have that are in North Florida, I think this is just from what I believe I heard. I think that they're going to move away from some of the NAR documents to more the statewide FAR documents. But again, that's sort of I sort of got that in passing. But I do believe that they are going to be moving away from that. We're also going to try to make sure we have, if possible, a uniform buyer brokerage agreement that we've approved for Florida Realty and Mortgage that the agents are to use. That we don't have 30 different variations floating across the state, because that would not be probably beneficial. The main template probably needs to be the same, and we will try to make sure that it is non-scary. Again, as the managing broker, one of the things that we're going to provide to you is a buyer brokerage agreement, as well as a digital packet and physical packet that helps the experience that you're going to have with the buyer to sign the document. It helps that comfort level. We're not going to give you something that basically increases their anxiety and their fear. That's not my goal. We're going to do just the opposite. It'll be professional. It's going to look great. It'll explain exactly what it needs to explain. And it will give them a very, very clear understanding of what this does and why it's doing it. But it's the experience to the buyer that I am most concerned with, that when you show them the buyer broker agreement and or a presentation, a buyer presentation, whether on a digital platform or physical platform, whether you're texting it, emailing it, showing it off their phone, your iPad, whatever it is, that it's a great experience. That's what we're going to give you. And yes, it definitely should not be scary. I've seen an advertising for an app that will do quick offers in order to learn the commission. You would submit an offer and then the seller will respond with a counter. I don't see, if there is an app that does all these quick offers, I do believe it. I don't believe that's probably going to be the norm on how buyers agents are going to try to figure out how they're paid, by sending in a whole bunch of quick, not fake offers, but quick offers. I'm sort of trying to interpret this, but it appears they're doing it basically to learn the commission. And I don't believe that's a good industry standard, just to send in quick offers. That's not what I'm going to propose. That's not what I'm going to recommend. That's not what I'm going to endorse. I believe legitimate offers as a whole over time are basically going to flush out in the context of this is what the sellers want to pay based on, again, the entire circumstance of what the net result is to them. But I'll be very, very clear. If anybody has the idea of sending in quick offers simply to learn the commission amount, we're not endorsing that. That does as a whole, that does not, without even going through a law dictionary or great thought, seem to be a good, solid business practice. So I would not endorse that. Once an agent made a buyer agreement, let's say 3% or $10,000, can the buyer's agent reduce? Yes, they can, based on final negotiating. Absolutely. Buyer's agent, again, can reduce the commission. It can go down, just can't go up. Are we going to be considered transaction brokers for listing agent or single agent? At this moment, the legislation does not seem to have something in it which would change the construct that in the state of Florida that you can be a transaction brokerage. That's come up before in 1 or 2 seminars that I was able to participate in on a national level, and it does not believe at this moment that that language, that proposed language, would eliminate a transaction broker or transaction brokerage. So single agent, it appears, would still be viable, transaction would still be viable, and non-representation would also still be viable. will I be able to, will I be able legally to ask the seller's agent if the seller is going to pay my buyer's commission? Or this only goes into the offer presented. To my knowledge, at the moment, I do believe you can actually make a phone call. You can call the agency, by the way, has the seller predetermined that they're going to pay the buyer's agent, and what's the amount? I do believe phone calls are absolutely allowable. If I am incorrect, I will let you know. But I do believe, based on what my current understanding as of mid-April of 2024, that yes, I do believe that's allowable. I don't see as a whole an army of buyer's agents calling on army of listing agents. I just see eventually that people are going to send in their contracts and they're just going to negotiate back and forth as part of a net experience. But yes, I currently do believe you can make a phone call. What about bonuses to compensation? Several builders are offering bonuses. Gary, that's a great question. And that's one of the things I actually started this with. I'm going to have to sort of flush out and acquire more detail for myself before I give you that advice. How do you handle builder bonuses, that extra compensation? I'm going to table that because I'm not going to give you advice or recommendation that I don't believe I have a sound legal understanding of. Again, not being an attorney, it's not legal advice, but at least some reference point where I can reasonably say, I believe it says this. The entire builder compensation and bonuses, I've got to table that for the moment. And I really need to get us through April, May, and possibly June, July to go through this, to get a little more clarification on what they will allow and what they won't allow on a buyer broker agreement. But it's a valid one. I actually think I started this talk on that too. Will it be more advantageous for the buyer to work with the listing agent? It's the same environment. It will have the same advantage or disadvantage or non-advantage that it does have in our current environment. Either way, the buyer is going to sign a buyer broker agreement with the listing agent or the buyer's agent. And how they perceive that is their own interpretation. So I don't see that there is probably an advantage or disadvantage industry-wide on how that happens. But I can see buyers going to a listing agent thinking possibly, at least initially, that they don't have to sign a buyer broker agreement, but they are incorrect. Now, what the buyer broker agreement for the listing agent eventually has, that's something that they would have to negotiate with the buyer independently. I think that is the last typed question. Oh, no, it's not. Page 3. Sorry, I am wrong. Can the listing agent tell the buyer's agent what the seller is compensating the buyer's agent? Can the listing agent tell the buyer's agent what the seller is? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, if to my knowledge at this moment, yes, the buyer's agent, listing agent can have verbal conversation, and yes, they can absolutely convey this is what the listing agent is willing to pay. I don't believe that is currently not allowed. But if I'm incorrect, I will let you know. What happens if what happens if buyer agrees to X commission at closing, but after it closes cannot or does not pay? What is our recourse to getting paid? If there's several scenarios in there. If the buyer broker agreement, if you are representing the buyer and you close on a property, the buyer broker agreement is most likely going to be probably part of the purchase agreement itself. So what you're saying is, what if the buyer and seller make an agreement? The buyer agreement is obligating the buyer to pay is obligating that the buyer's agent receive a certain commission. So at closing, that buyer's agent, the buyer agent and listing agent, that combination is going to have it being paid. Let me see if I can reword it so it comes out a little clearer. I'm playing about 3 or 4 scenarios in my head at the same time. So let me see if I can stay on one. If you have a closing and the buyer has signed a buyer broker agreement with you, but somehow you get a net sheet and it says, wow, the buyer doesn't have enough funds, he has to pay it. He he would in fact then not be showing up at closing without enough money. It doesn't close. My current understanding is that buyer broker agreement is just as valid as a legal document as the purchase agreement. If the buyer was supposed to show up with a certain amount of money at closing, and he is deficient that money at closing, the title company or attorney's office is simply not going to finalize the transaction. They're not going to finalize the transaction with there being a deficit, and that deficit also means the agent's commission, just as it exists now. If you submit an offer and the seller refuses to pay and the buyer can't pay but still wants to buy the house, what then? If you submit an offer and the seller refuses to pay and the buyer can't pay, it's part of the term, and then it's not the right house. The buyer broker agreement is part of the terms that the buyer has agreed to negotiate. And they've agreed one way or another, you as the agent are going to receive compensation. If you want to lower the amount, you can lower it, but you're not obligated to lower it. There's no expectation to do that. So if they submit an offer and it is deficient funds, it's just not the right property. A buyer and seller cannot come to a net experience that has all things paid. I can use the same argument. Buyer and seller have an agreement, but based on what the buyer wants to pay, there's just not enough money to pay the seller's mortgage, completely off. Then it's not the right property. Each side has expenses, closing costs, prepaids, title expense, mortgage expense, agent's expense. If all of those cannot be satisfied between the negotiation between the buyer and the seller, it's just not the right property. They're not able to get into an agreement that makes it the right property. Do you see more brokerages going towards the effort or business model? Why isn't NAR correcting the media and that brokerages receive the commission, not the realtors? First of all, I absolutely do see that the industry is going to, as a migration, the brokerages are probably going to have more pressure to justify you giving them money, because you're going to have more pressure justifying why you should receive money. So yes, I do believe that more brokerages are going to probably have pressure to give a higher commission split. As far as the narrative of why they don't currently try to counteract a lot of the news media and social media, I would probably suspect, just my guess, because they're currently in the midst of litigation, and anything they do say will be held against them in a court of law. Anytime you're in litigation, you normally try to limit what you're saying to the media or on social media, or try not to expand it. What is the timing for us to have to make all decisions right now, get the buyer broker agreement signed? At this moment, you are currently under our current guidelines, which means you don't have to use a buyer brokerage agreement. As of mid-April, it is not a requirement. It's proposed in early July. It will be a requirement, and when it gets to that, we'll help you with timeframes and documents. But at the moment, you can still work with buyers just as you always have. You're not forced to have a buyer broker agreement. So if you have a buyer's broker agreement that states 3%, and they purchase new constructions offering a 2% bonus, again, that I'm really going to have to table. I'm going to have to, once I see the buyer broker agreement and I can see how we can structure those clauses to account for those situations. But right now, I actually have to table it. They've given high-level guidelines, and I really can't interpret how I can have legal verbiage that would not be in contradiction to the Department of Justice and the intent of what they want to accomplish. So I'm tabling that one. Will lenders be able to hire salaried buyers agents as a value added? That's a great question. Don't know. That's that's sort of a mortgage question, to be honest. I don't see any federal guideline on it. Whether they want to hire a buyer's agent as a value added, don't know. What you're looking at is a new business model, and that could happen. I can't tell you how much it would happen or frequency, but I don't believe it's in contradiction to any current law again, but I'm not an attorney. Let's see if we can go to some general questions. Any general questions? How are you?
Good, and you?
Very good.
Thank you, because this is great, okay?
It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Hi, this is Raquel Geller. Hi, James. My
Hi.
main question is, how the hell did this happen? I actually went and read some of the testimony by Gary Keller. I was flabbergasted. I was astounded. I want to know how this happened.
Well, one, given that they're still in the litigation phase and that they're still in the proposed settlement phase and is being reviewed by Department of Justice, all I can say is that it was surprising that the narrative that allowed some of this to exist really got that far. But I can't go a whole lot into it, to be honest. Is that a safe answer?
Yes. I mean, I hope that one day, because I was really shocked. I mean, one of the reasons I joined FHRM is so I could have more leeway to negotiate commissions. And that's what I had explained. So I keep thinking, how did this get so far? So you just told me.
And the seller has always had 100% control over what they wish to pay and not pay. That negotiation doesn't change. So there are some surprises, I think, that all of us basically felt when this started to transition and became more real, and when some of the judgments came in. I think we're all somewhat surprised, to be honest.
Okay. All right. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't the only.
No, you are not the only one. Will this finally get rid of RELO? I don't think it'll get rid of RELO. I can still see referrals going back and forth. As listing agents, can we advertise seller will pay buyer's agent closing costs? I'm going to abstain from answering that at the moment. I would have to say, if I had to guess, without giving a legal opinion, I do not think any display of any acknowledgement of compensation will probably be allowed, because the intent is to, in all digital formats from a multiple listing system, that a buyer's agent cannot differentiate from a digital format what properties have a compensation being paid and which ones do not, and what the amounts are. So my guess would be that they're not going to allow some verbiage that notifies a buyer's agent through an electronic means that yes, you can be paid. I don't believe that would be allowed. Do you believe that the current listings will all need to be redone, or do they expect them to be grandfathered in? That one, actually, I really don't know. As we go a little bit from April, and we go into some of these future months, I'll give some clarification. Whatever it is, I promise that we're here to support you, and we'll make it as easy as possible. Whatever guidelines they basically advise us to do, Florida Homes as a company is going to make sure that it's easy on you as the agents as possible. But it's a great question. I just don't want to try to give you a definitive answer at this moment. Several people advertise to sellers they will list your home for a lesser compensation online. Those do not do much for sellers. Do we need to give the listing agent a buyer's agreement? Let me read it again. On. Several people advertise to sellers that they will list your home for a lesser compensation online. Those do not do much for a seller. Do we need to give that listing agent a buyer's agent agreement? I still believe that marketing to a seller as a customer, I'll address at least what the piece of this that I can make. The piece of it to a seller, I do believe as an agent would still have the ability to send marketing to an owner saying, hey, by the way, I will do a commission, a listing commission at a lower amount. And you would probably only specify your side, and based on that discussion, then the seller could then determine if they want any buyer's agent commission or not. But I would probably have the new representation only affect the listing side with no expectation whatsoever on the buyer's side in all media, if you were doing advertising to an owner. Since Lee Osborne writes and teaches contracts for a board, will you consider having Lee to do a class on that? Lee's fantastic, great gentleman. I would absolutely consider it. We will take all of the professional assistance in our industry that somebody wants to provide. He's a great person, and absolutely, we would absolutely endorse it and as well as entertain it. May Lee teach a class on the subject we're discussing to our agents? Absolutely, again. Great guy, and we would be very open to anybody in our field professionally to assist in this transition. Should the pre-qualification with the lender also include payment of an agent? Sort of a yes or no. It really comes back to the buyer. I can sign a buyer's broker agreement saying, look, I guarantee you that I'll make sure that whatever experience, whatever offer I do will incorporate, you get paid this amount of money. And I understand either I'm going to pay it, or whatever house I decide on has to have in it that they will pay it, or some combination. But you can, it doesn't hurt. I think that's a conversation you probably have to have with the buyer to see, based on the various scenarios, whether it's their expectation that they are going to pay some of that fee or all the fee, or is it their expectation that they're going to try to have the seller or owner pay some or all that fee? But so if you should have that fee in the pre-qualification, that's part of the discussion you probably want with the buyer, as far as what they believe, how they're going to get that fee paid. Again, I think a lot of buyers are not going to want to have that fee come out of pocket on their end. I still believe, without giving a legal opinion, I do believe that a lot of buyers are probably going to see if they can shift that cost over to the seller, so they're not going out of pocket personally. All right. I think that's the last amount of questions. I appreciate everybody being on this. If anybody has any questions, concerns, or comments, as always, you can reach out to me. And it's James Angelo, Florence Realty and Mortgage, and I'm at 904-412-7889. Thank you all.